Welcome everyone to our 2025 Year in Review webinar. Today, you'll be hearing from Corey Davis, Assistant State Climatologist, who will share key climate stories for North Carolina over the past year. Then, Dr. Jared Bowden, Interim Director of the State Climate Office, will zoom out a bit and give us an overview of the global and national climate trends in 2025. As a quick reminder, please stay muted throughout the presentation. We expect the presentation to last about 45 minutes, and we'll wrap up with some time for questions. Please ask your questions in the chat as they arise throughout the presentation. That way we have a few in stock ready to go. If you're not already following us on social media, you should. You can find us on all the socials listed here. And if you post about today's webinar, be sure to use the hashtag so we can find your post and like it. All right, let me tell you a little bit about the State Climate Office. We are a UNC system public service center dedicated to the needs of North Carolinians by translating climate information into useful and usable knowledge. We bridge the gap between scientists, decision makers, and community members. On the right, you'll see one of our 45 EcoNet stations across the state. And in the middle, you'll see one of our most recent team photos as we celebrated the end of 2025. Now, I'm going to hand it over to Corey to kick us off.
All right, thanks a lot, Allison. Good morning. Welcome, everybody. Always excited to be here for now, I think the fifth year in a row for our year in review. We've got a lot to cover, so we'll go ahead and get started. And as always, I like to start by going through some of the statistics and some of the key rankings over the past year. Now, one reason why we wait a few weeks into the year to hold this webinar is to give time for that final data, those final reports from our weather stations to come in, to be processed. And then last week at the National Centers for Environmental Information, based out of Asheville, they did that number crunching to tell us where things officially ended up for the year of 2025. So let's go over that part now. First off, they tell us that 2025 was the 22nd warmest year on record in North Carolina, and that's based on data that goes back to 1895. Now, if you were here for last year's webinar, you might have remembered we were at the second warmest year on record in 2024. So we weren't quite that extreme for 2025, but this was still a warmer than normal year overall, and it was warmer even compared to our recent history. It was about 0.3 of a degree warmer than the latest 30-year average. I think this is always easier to pick out when you look at a graph like this that shows historically what those annual average temperatures have looked like. Again, you can see we have been in a very warm past decade across North Carolina. Each of the past 11 years now, since 2015, has ranked as warmer than that 1991 to 2020 average. One way that I like to describe this to people is if you took one of these recent years and superimposed it across most of the 20th century, that year would look out of place because of how much warmer it is than most of the surrounding years. But you see, in this case, we've clustered so many of those warm years together. 2025 actually looks like a cooler year, but again, it is still warmer than average and still a fairly high-ranking year overall for our state. I also like to look at some of the local rankings across the state. You see in most areas where it's highlighted in this pink or peach color, these areas were basically in the warmest third of all years that they've ever observed, especially across parts of the mountains in Piedmont. That was generally the case. Some of our coastal areas were a little bit closer to normal. They were a little bit cooler than some of the other areas. That includes coastal sites like Elizabeth City and New Bern. Again, still warmer than normal overall, but just not in that warmest tier, warmest echelon of years that we've seen elsewhere. So some of the warmer spots include places like Raleigh, which tied for the fifth warmest year on record. Charlotte had its seventh warmest year on record, and Asheville had its 12th warmest year on record. You see a number of these western sites ranked among the top 10% of all years based on the average temperatures. I really like showing this graph. This shows us how those temperatures changed by month and how those compared to the historical average. When you look at all 12 months in 2025, I would say one month sticks out like a sore thumb. It looks like it just doesn't belong, and that's January because of how much colder it was than all the other months during the year. Of course, we remember at this time last year, that's when we were right in between a couple snow events. We were really in the freezer. We had some very cold temperatures for several weeks, but that cold really did not last that long in the grand scheme of things. We warmed up pretty quickly by February. The rest of the spring was fairly warm as well. We actually had our second warmest April on record statewide. We were more than 5 degrees warmer than normal for that month. And then the warmth continued on into the summer. In June, we had some of those 100-degree high temperatures. And July was notable not just because of how warm the afternoons were, but also how warm the nights were. It was very warm, very humid. We'll talk later about some of the records that were set that month, but again, a number of very warm nights that made July really stand out. I know by the end of July, a lot of folks, including me, were really sick of the summer heat. We just wanted to cool off, and we did by August. It was cooler, it was cloudier, a couple degrees cooler than average. And then that cooler weather really continued through at least part of the rest of the year. We had a nice seasonable fall in September and October. November was a little bit warmer, and then we had some warmer spells in December as well. But again, for the most part, closer to average for the last 4 months of the year. So here's how our precipitation stacked up. Probably appropriately for the year 2025, it was our 25th driest year on record. Again, this is based on data since 1895. That gives us 131 or so years to stack up against. So again, definitely on the drier side last year. And statewide, we were about 6 inches below average in terms of precipitation. I'll show that same month by month graph in just a minute, but you'll notice on there that it wasn't just one month that put us in this deficit. It was really the sum of multiple dry months that led to us being this much drier than normal over the past year. Again, here's that graph that shows all historical years and how their average annual precip stacks up. You'll note that we were slightly wetter than normal in 2024, so we shifted back to the dry side for 2025. Also of note is that we're not too far removed from our two wettest years on record in North Carolina. That was in 2018 and then in 2020. You'll see that there's not a huge trend on this graph. We're not necessarily seeing a steady upward or downward trend in our precip. But one thing we have seen in recent years is the extremes becoming even more extreme. So those very wet years are definitely standing out a little bit more. Now, looking at 2025 specifically, it's pretty much in the same ballpark as years like 2022 and 2012, a similar level of dryness as some of those other recent years. It is worth noting, though, that this was our driest year statewide since 2007. And for folks who have been around North Carolina for a while, that may kind of set off an alarm bell for you because 2007 was very dry. It was actually the driest year on record statewide. And we saw a lot of drought get very bad very quickly that year. So luckily, 2025 wasn't anywhere near as dry as we saw in 2007. But yeah, kind of a quirk of the data. We haven't seen a year that dry since that very dry 2007 year. Here's what some of the local rankings looked like in terms of precipitation. I would say generally the further west you went, the drier you were. That include places like Jefferson that had its fifth driest year on record. You'll see it was almost 18 inches below normal, so that's quite a bit drier than we saw with the statewide average. Also, Statesville had one of its top 10 driest years on record, and it was about 11 inches below normal. Across the rest of the state, it was kind of a mix. A number of coastal sites were a little bit drier than normal, but as we got into the Piedmont, that's where we saw our few wetter than normal areas. Places like Chapel Hill were on the wetter side. It was actually the 14th wettest year on record there. And if you think about what these areas have in common, it's really one event. Tropical Storm Chantal in July dropped 8 to 10 inches in that part of the state. And really, if you remove Chantal from the equation, these areas would be just about as dry as their surroundings. So we have that one event really to thank for the few wet spots that we've got in that part of the state. Again, here's that graph that shows the monthly precipitation departures. I would say there's also one month that really stands out as being a lot different from the rest on here, and that is May. That was the one really wet month that we had back in 2025. We were more than 3 inches above average in terms of precipitation. That was followed by some generally slightly wet conditions in the summer months, but only maybe a tenth to half a degree above average as far as precipitation goes. So only one really wet month and then a number of dry months beginning in January, continuing in the first part of the spring, and then especially re-emerging by the fall, September, November, December, all at least an inch drier than normal. So that's one of the big stories that we'll see coming up in some of the other slides today. Just that persistent dryness, especially in the first half of the year and then in the last half of the year. So if you read our December climate summary, you've already seen some of the things on this slide. I thought it was worth highlighting here today as well. Some of the records that were set in 2025. Now, as we saw with the statewide rankings, it was not that extreme of a year in terms of temperatures or precipitation, but there were some local extremes that were set in several different categories over the last year. And we can start with the temperatures. So, as has been the case in many recent years, there were more warm extremes than cool extremes in 2025, but we did have a little bit of both over the last year. One that's really worth knowing is that in Raleigh, they tied the all-time warmest low temperature of 80 degrees back on July 18th. So it never got cooler than 80 degrees for that entire day. That is just sweltering, miserable weather, especially at that hottest time of the year. But we also saw some warm weather even outside of the summer. At the end of the year, Charlotte had back-to-back record highs on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in the upper 70s to near 80 degrees, so well above normal for that time of the year in that part of the state. And again, we did have some cooler temperatures as well, especially late in the summer. And actually, on 3 days in a row in August, Greensboro had new daily record cool high temperatures. A couple of these days it never even made it out of the 60s. So again, that speaks to how much of a flip that we had from that very warm July to a much cooler August. We also saw some snowfall records set last year, which was a nice thing for folks who like snow because it had been a few years since we really had any snow to talk about. Again, over those previous 3 years or so, we had been in these long snow droughts. And finally, last January, places like Marion and Shelby broke out of a 1,000-day record-long snow drought. They finally picked up a little bit of snow last winter, again, for the first time in several years. But we also saw some snow later in the year. So up in the northeastern corner of the state, the Edenton area had their earliest measurable snowfall on record. It wasn't a lot of snow. It was just a couple tenths of an inch, but still that was measurable snow, and that's earlier than they had ever seen, dating back more than a century. And then in terms of precipitation and drought, we also had some records last year. First, when we were in that drought coming out of the winter, going into the spring, we saw some very low river levels and stream flow levels. And in fact, in the month of March, the North Fork Swananoa River near Asheville had its record low level for the month of March. Later in the summer, we saw that extreme event with Tropical Storm Chantal, and that set several records as well. Places like Burlington and Chapel Hill had their record rainfall over a 24-hour period. And then along the Hall and Eno rivers, some of the river gauges there had new record high crests following Chantal. I really think that's one of the most impressive stories of 2025. If you had told folks in the Triangle area that some of those records from Hurricane Fran would eventually be beat, they would have said that's got to be a Category 5 because nothing can be worse than Fran. So it's even more impressive that when Chantal came through, it was only a tropical depression, and yet it still brought that much rainfall and set records like these across parts of the state. So as we shift gears a little bit, we can dive into some of the weather stories season by season. I think this is a good way of thinking about what happened and what evolved throughout the year. And really, all these stories revolve around precipitation and some of the extremes that we saw throughout the year. The first one in the winter is that we did finally see that return of snow for the first time in almost 3 years in some areas. This is the total snowfall that we saw across the state over the past winter, starting in November 2024 and running through the end of March in 2025. I know some folks already reported some of their local accumulations. I would say those match up pretty well with the map here. We heard a report from the northeastern corner of the state, and really that area was the big winner in 2025. There were a couple pretty sizable snows up there, especially up toward Elizabeth City. They saw 8 inches in one event in February and more than a foot for the entire season. So it was a snowier than normal year up in that part of the state. Across the rest of the state, we saw really some mixed numbers. In the usual areas, the higher elevations of the mountains, of course, they did see some higher snow totals. But the Asheville area only saw a couple inches. That was pretty far below normal for the year there. In parts of the Piedmont, most areas were generally a little below normal. Raleigh came in pretty much right at their average of about 5 inches per year. Further south of there, especially down in the Sandhills, some of those snow events switched over to freezing rain or sleet or just plain old rain. So they didn't see quite as much snow over the past winter. And then we already talked about the eastern part of the state. They generally saw some pretty good snow amounts. I know last year's year in review webinar, I gave a preview. I said, watch out for the southeastern corner of the state, especially down here in Brunswick County. It had been more than a decade since they had seen a decent snow event. And right after that, they did pick up good snow in late January. So they finished the year with more than 4 inches in total, which is better than a good chunk of the state did this past winter. So after that, we switched into the spring, and again, it did start warming up pretty early as we got into February. Worth noting the overall temperature ranking. Last spring was the second warmest on record statewide, just prevailing warmth through all 3 months of the spring season. Also, we had a pretty early last spring freeze. In most areas, that last freeze was in the first week of March. So you would think with that much warm weather and with an early freeze that that would be great for farmers, that the ag folks would be loving it. And instead, it wasn't a very good spring for them because of that drought that was in place, especially coming out of the winter and into the first half of the spring season. Even in April, that's when that growing season really gets ramped up. We were dealing with moderate drought across more than half of the state. And then finally, by late April and especially early May, we started seeing that rain return, and then we wiped most of that drought off the map as we got into the summer season. Just a few key stats to note from the spring. First off, in the Asheville area, again, they had been very dry ever since Hurricane Helene had moved through in late 2024. So in early May, they saw their wettest day since Helene, more than 2 inches of rain back on May the 8th. Again, that was kind of a shock after they had been so dry for so long. Also, down in the eastern part of the state, New Bern had its third wettest May on record, more than 8 inches in total for the month there. And again, that was coming off several very dry months during the winter and spring. In that northeastern corner of the state, that had been the first area to go into drought over the previous fall in 2024. This was also the final area to come out of drought late last spring and early last summer. In total, they had been in a drought for almost 8 months, so a fairly long-lived drought event. But again, they finally dug out of that with some of the rain that we had late last spring. Then, as we moved into the summer, that wet pattern definitely continued. The best words I could think of to describe the summer are soggy and steamy across most of the state. We did have some pretty good shower activity in June, but the big event again was Tropical Storm Chantal that moved through the first weekend in July. A couple really impressive things about this storm. We already talked about some of the record river levels that were set in the wake of Chantal, but I think just taking a step back, you look at the rainfall amounts that fell from that system, more than 10 inches across parts of Alamance and Chatham and Orange counties. Those are really high totals that these areas are not used to seeing. And most of that rain fell over only about a 12-hour period. So some really intense rain rates from that system. You can get a feel for the track of that storm on here. It had been down off our southern coastline, sitting over that warm water of the Atlantic, picking up a lot of moisture, and then it took this jog to the west, so it dropped all that moisture as that really heavy rain pretty far inland. So again, I think 10 years from now, Chantal may be the story that we remember the most from 2025. Then after Chantal, we had some more stormy, rainy weather. We had some showers and storms that set up in the same areas that were affected by Chantal and caused some more flooding. But also that moisture in the atmosphere and the environment led to some really humid conditions at all hours of the day, and that led to some record overnight low temperatures. The calendar here shows just for the Raleigh reporting station, you see the number of nights that were above 75 degrees, and highlighted in red are new record low temperatures that were set, including that all-time record that was tied of 80 degrees back on July 18th. So again, I think when we add together the influence of Chantal, that lingering moisture, some of the other summer rain, along with the very warm air mass at our hottest time of the year, then this was the end result. Some extremely warm temperatures at all hours of the day. And of course, after that pretty wet summer, we switched over into a dry fall. This actually began in the middle of August, but I would say at first it wasn't too much of a concern because we had had so much rain leading up to that drier pattern returning. By later in the season, we did start to have more concerns about drought. You see drought had emerged across the eastern part of the state in October, and it started to spread west after that in November and December. Just a few stats to note across the state during that dry fall. First, in the eastern part of the state, in the Snow Hill area, this was kind of the epicenter of that severe drought that emerged by late October. At one point, they went 41 days in a row with less than a quarter inch of rainfall. So when you stack up that many dry days at that time of the year, this was in September and early October, it will definitely make a difference and create those impacts like we were seeing on the map here. Then after that, again, we saw the drought started to spread west in November. That was after Charlotte had its eighth driest November on record. Charlotte and a number of other Piedmont sites had less than an inch of rain in total for the month of November. And we also felt the impacts of that. We didn't have a significantly active fall fire season, but there were still some wildfires across the state, including up in the northwestern part of the state. There was a 160-acre fire up in the Banner Elk area. This was very typical of a lot of the other wildfires last year. A lot of them were in the western part of the state, and in areas where there was still lingering storm damage and debris from Hurricane Helene. So we know that will be an ongoing problem, not just in 2026, but at least for the next decade. There were so many downed trees, so much debris after Helene that it's not going to go away overnight. As it continues to dry out and decay, it'll be more able to burn and smolder, and it'll create more bad wildfire seasons like we saw in 2025. So that's a nice segue to some of our weather hazards. We'll talk about fires in just a minute, but first, I want to talk about drought overall because it was one of those very common background storylines that we dealt with all throughout the year. I like this chart here. This shows the percentage of the state that was in each U.S. drought monitor category throughout the year. So we start with last January over on the left. You see, at that point, we were dealing with about 40% of the state in moderate drought, most of the rest of the state in abnormally dry conditions. By late January, early February, we now had more than 90% of the state in moderate drought. So folks sometimes think drought really isn't a problem in the wintertime, but we can definitely see more expansive drought and drought impacts, even in our cooler time of the year. We dealt with that drought really all throughout the spring and then finally saw those improvements in May and June as that rain returned. That led to this respite that we had during most of the warm season, where we weren't really too concerned about drought or dryness. And then finally, that started ramping back up in the fall and is still stuck with us since then. One thing you don't see on this graph is what's happened so far in 2026. We have seen a big ramp up in the coverage of severe drought, which is the orange color. And as of last week, more than 60% of the state is in severe drought in North Carolina. So, again, that has been a big change that's happened more recently since the end of 2025. We know that when we're dealing with drought, it probably affects agriculture the most. And based on county extension reports that we received throughout the year, we can kind of tell that story about how ag impacts were affected by drought over the past year. So starting off coming into the spring, again, this was after a fairly dry winter and early spring, but also fairly warm conditions in February and March. We started getting reports from places like Stokes County that said when they walked outside, their grass was about as crunchy as it usually was in August, and this was in March. So that's how dry and warm things had been at that point. And then also some of their forage crops just weren't germinating. They were really counting on those to get going early in the season, again, with that warm weather that we were seeing, and there just wasn't enough moisture for those crops to get started. We heard more of the same as we started shifting into the month of April. Again, pastures and small grains really struggling to get going with that lack of moisture. So at that point, they said, we expect it's going to be a slow start to the growing season. They were really dependent on that soil moisture building back up before they could get a lot of those crops planted and to germinate at that point. And of course, the pattern flipped as we went into May. It became very wet. And then by the end of May, we had farmers like the ones down in Pender County that said it had been so wet, they had to wait for it to dry out enough before they could start planting the soybeans down there. The fields had just been so wet after several weeks of heavy rain that they couldn't get out there and do any work. One really positive story for ag that we saw in 2025 was how the corn did last year. If you think back to 2024, we had that flash drought that hit in June and July, really the worst possible timing for the corn crop because that's the point in the year when it needs the most moisture. So the corn crop really struggled in 2024, but it had a lot better rain and better moisture during that key time in the growing season last year. So for the most part, the corn did a whole lot better in 2025. Again, the moisture was pretty good throughout last summer. No big concerns from agriculture. But then as we got back in that dry pattern in the fall, that's where we did start to see some of those impacts reemerge. A lot of the crops like corn were able to be harvested before it really turned too dry. But some of the later planted crops like the soybeans and the cotton, they needed just a little bit more rain late in the growing season that never arrived. So in early October in Johnston County, they were seeing the soybeans and the cotton were browning and wilting and just not growing as quickly as they would expect at that time of the year. And if I had another report to share from just the last few weeks, it would probably sound a lot like these ones from Stokes and Gaston County last spring, is that some of those small grains and pastures are really struggling again. They do need some more moisture, even though we're in the cool season, and they're definitely hoping we get some more rain before we head into the growing season here in 2026. I mentioned the wildfires, so here's what some of the numbers show for the wildfire activity across the state last year. This is based on data from the North Carolina Forest Service. They track fire activity on state and private lands. And I'll note that the values they're showing for 2025 are still preliminary. They are waiting for some of the final data to come in from the end of the year. But based on what they've got here, 2025 actually had the most number of wildfires of any year in the past decade. You see, it was slightly more than what we saw back in 2022. And then, based on the amount of acreage burned, this was the third highest year out of the past decade. Still definitely an uptick over the average, but nowhere close to what we saw back in 2016 and 2023, again, that were much more active years in terms of fire activity. I would say last year was probably more defined by a spring fire season than it was by a fall fire season. And like we already mentioned, one of the big problems was in Western North Carolina. Areas that are still dealing with that damage and debris after Helene are burning, and they're burning big. They're harder to get to because of all those downed trees. So that'll continue to be a problem for years to come. We can shift gears and talk about the tropics now. Really interesting year in the Atlantic last year. We ended up with 13 named storms in total. That's pretty much right near normal, pretty close to what the predictions were for the season. There were some that had a little bit more activity, but again, based on the number of storms, pretty much right near average. But we look and see where these storms developed and where they tracked, and that's where we had some surprises. For the most part, a lot of these storms developed out over the open ocean. They tracked toward land, but mostly curved away before they reached land. And we saw very few storms forming down in the Gulf and down in the Caribbean. In fact, there was only one storm the entire year that formed in the Caribbean, and that was Melissa back in late October. Now, across this region, there had been a lot of wind shear back early in the summer. Certainly, that would have cut down on some of the activity across that region. And really, I would have, at this point last year, I would have said, watch the Gulf. That's where Helene formed in 2024. It rapidly intensified in that region. I expected we might see more big storms in that area last year, and really it just never panned out. So certainly the lack of activity in that part of the basin cut down on the overall number of storms in 2025. There were several storms that affected North Carolina last year. The main one again was Chantal, and we can see on this map it became a tropical storm just to our south, sat over the open ocean there for a couple days, and then took that jog inland where it dropped that really heavy rain across the central part of the state. That was in early July. The next storm we dealt with was Hurricane Erin. This was in mid to late August. You see, Erin was coming up just north of the Bahamas. It took this curve off of our coastline. So while the center of the storm stayed a couple hundred miles away, Erin was a really big storm. It had pretty wide reaching rain bands. So we did see some rain, some erosion, some overwash right along the Outer Banks there in far eastern North Carolina. And then finally in late September, we had Hurricane Imelda to our south. It looked like Imelda was on a beeline, headed due north straight for us. And then we had a system that moved in from the northwest that helped Imelda go back out to sea. So only parts of our immediate southern coastline picked up a little bit of rain from that storm. So we never want to see a hurricane in North Carolina, but that sort of system with Imelda, high-end tropical storm, low-end hurricane, it would have been nice if we saw at least a little bit more rain from a system like that, because that's when we were really getting into that dry pattern late last fall. We did still have some impacts from those tropical systems. Again, first and foremost, we saw the flooding in central Piedmont after Tropical Storm Chantal. We see the depth of the floodwaters here in parts of Alamance County in the day or two after that storm moved through. And then right along the coast, we were certainly thinking about our friends and partners at Department of Transportation last year because it seemed like it was just one thing after another right along the Outer Banks, and especially on Highway 12. They had the Hurricane Erin that came through in the fall, especially October. They had several nor'easter type events that caused more overwash. There were more houses falling into the ocean. There were more road closures there on 12. So even in a year without many hurricanes, it can still be a busy season for those folks down along the coastline. And then finally, in terms of hazards, we can talk about confirmed tornadoes last year. This is a pretty empty map. There were only 16 confirmed tornadoes statewide in 2025. And as you see in the bullet point here, that's the fewest in North Carolina in a calendar year since 2016. There's a couple main reasons for that. One is that we were in that drought in the spring during our typical heart of severe thunderstorm season. So you may notice on the map here, there were no tornadoes in the month of April. That's usually when we see the most tornadoes, and instead there were zero last year. We did see some more in May as we started getting in that more active weather pattern. You see a cluster of tornadoes in the Triangle area associated with Tropical Storm Chantal. But after that, there were no tornadoes anywhere in the state after August the 15th. That's only the second time in the last 40 years that that's happened. The only other time was 2009. The last thing I'll note about this map is that there were no storm or tornadoes at EF2 strength or greater. That's the first time since 2015 where we've gone an entire calendar year with no storms of that strength. So, again, not as many tornadoes as we would expect. Another factor was just not seeing those tropical storms move through in the fall. Thinking back to a year like 2024, we had almost 20 tornadoes just from tropical systems. So when we don't get those, not only does it worsen our drought, but it also means we don't see as much severe weather like tornado events. So as I've tried to think about a way to describe our weather in 2025, number one, it stands out as a year of contrast. And I think this is a good way to put it. It's a year ultimately that was defined by dryness. It was drier than normal statewide, drier than normal in most areas. We had that drought and drought impacts present across a good chunk of the year. And yet again, I think 5 or 10 years from now, when we think back on 2025, we may remember it most for the storm events. So not for the dryness, but for the precip that we did get, whether it was the snow in the wintertime, whether it was that big inland impact that Chantal had over the summer, or whether it was some of those fall coastal events and nor'easters that caused some of the issues along the Outer Banks. Some of the other key stories from North Carolina last year are those really warm summer nights, especially during July. It was that we were in a La Nina pattern both early in the year and late in the year, and we know that was a driver in that dryness that we felt, and also that active spring fire season, especially in the western part of the state. Again, I hate to say it, but I really think that's a sign of things to come. More of those Helene affected areas will keep seeing those big wildfire events, especially when we're in drought over the next decade or so. So at that point, I will give my voice a rest and turn it over to Jared Bowden, our interim director, and he will give us some broader perspectives on the last year in North Carolina.
Thanks, Corey. The first thing is I should mention that I am the interim director, and I took this position recently. Our former state climatologist, Dr. Kathy Dello, is now the assistant secretary for resilience at DEQ, and so we miss Kathy here, and but we're gonna try to take over what Kathy used to do here, and that's my job. I want to point out that something that's important that's coming up that our office is leading. There was a North Carolina climate science report that was released in 2020. We are we were asked by the governor to update the North Carolina climate science report, with that report being due in October of this year. And so you'll see, hopefully, if you're wanting to know about the state of the climate and updates in climate science for North Carolina, we'll have an soon. And so, Corey, if you go to the next slide, please. So the way that I'm thinking about it is as Allison mentioned earlier, is first thinking about a global perspective and where we stand. And so if you're looking at temperatures globally, it's the third warmest year on record globally since the pre-industrial period of since the 1850s. And we've had record warmth in the past 11 years globally. And what I'm showing you here is the global mean temperature anomaly and some uncertainties related to that. And this is relative to the pre-industrial period, 1850 to 1900. And what you'll clearly see is, if you look at all these years defined, these are the very recent years. So we're definitely on track. And 2024 globally was the warmest year on record, followed by 2023, but 2025 isn't far behind. And on average, the global temperatures were about 2.6 degrees Fahrenheit above that pre-industrial baseline from 1815 to 1900. Corey, if we go to the next slide. So what does this actually means? Well, if you were to look at how it compares, and you think about the number of days exceeding a certain threshold, for instance, 1.5 degrees C, which is really related to the Paris Agreement and things like that, you'll note that over a third of the days were above 1.5 degrees C globally on average. And if you look at 1 degree C, basically all days were above 1 degree C, above the pre-industrial baseline. And so this is translating into extremes. when you're the next thing I want to talk about is the ocean heat content. We basically have a global record set this year, and this is 9 consecutive years straight with ocean heat content records from starting back to 2017. And if you're looking at why this is important, well, 90% of the excess heat in the Earth's energy is absorbed by the oceans. And so what does that translate into in terms of storms and impacts is basically it's a source of energy and moisture for extreme weather. And so this is a really good measure of what's basically the energy imbalance that's happening between in our atmosphere. And if you're talking about how much energy was absorbed by the ocean, it's around what's around 23 zetajoules in 1 year, which is equivalent, and this is something that I was recently looking at. It's equivalent to the energy of 12 Hiroshima bombs exploding in the ocean every second. And this is a large also increase over the prior record of 2024, which was 16 zetajoules. And so our oceans globally are very warm. And this is basically when you're talking about the ocean heat content, it's the like the top 2,000 meters or the top 700 meters of the ocean on average the temperatures. So if you go down, um, if you're thinking about what it means for us, there was warmth, record warmth in parts. Well, I shouldn't say record, but there was anomalously warm temperatures in 2025 in the tropical Atlantic, and it doesn't compare to 2024 and 2023 records, but still were record warmth. And this has a lot, and this really impacts our storms and the energy that's needed to basically fuel these storms, as well as the moisture transport into the broader southeastern U.S. So if we go to the next slide, Corey. If you're looking at sea ice extent, and this is in millions of square kilometers, February of 2025 saw the lowest global extent of sea ice. And that's basically that. And the dotted line is the median from 1991 to 2020. And you can clearly see with that shading, that's basically the bounds. We were outside those bounds and we were on records in February of 2025. If you go to the next slide, Corey. So from a national perspective, if we think about this as a global perspective down to national, per NOAA, we were the fourth warmest year on record in the U.S. since 1895 and 2.63 degrees Fahrenheit above the 20th century average. And if you're looking at some of the record warmest years averages for the year, you'll see that the Intermountain West around the Rockies, places like Utah, and places where we're way above normal. If you go to the next slide, Corey, but the real key is that this was defined by very large temperature swings within the U.S. Uh, if you're looking at January on average, it was the coldest January since 1988 for the contiguous U.S. But then what happened, as Corey mentioned, thinking about these shifts, we went into a very warm spring, and that wasn't just for North Carolina, but the broader Southeast U.S. And then as you went into later in the year and you look towards November and December in particular, uh, out west, we saw record warmth in the western U.S. states. And so we had these large swings um, across the U.S., and that's typical of some things that we're seeing as Corey previously mentioned. If you go to the next slide, Corey. So from a precipitation perspective, if you're looking at on average for the contiguous U.S., we were the 40th driest in the last 130 plus years, and we were 0.71 inches below the 20th century average. But really, the telltale sign is again in the swings of precipitation. And so if you look at the contiguous U.S. and you look at, for instance, the broader southeast or eastern coast, as for instance, in the spring, we were above normal in terms of precipitation, and then towards the end of the year, the broader southeast and east coast went to below normal. And so we have these wild swings in precipitation, and so that kind of somewhat mutes when you're talking about on average what happens. If you go to the next slide, Corey. So thinking about the state perspective and what we saw, and you're thinking about plausible future scenarios, and so these are climate change projections out towards mid-century, and this is days with precipitation, for instance, with 3 inches. And one thing you'll see is that it shows like larger number of days further inland. And we've seen some of that being realized recently with extreme precipitation reaching farther inland in recent years. But also, as Corey talked about, on the right-hand side is looking at the change in minimum temperatures or days greater than 75 degrees. So these are your warm nights and the change in number of those nights. And you'll clearly see that this is anticipated to increase, and this is something that's being realized as Corey showed for our state. So if you go to the next slide, Corey, I think that might be closing it out for me. Thank you all again, and Corey, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. Thanks for that great overview. This last section is something we've just added in this year, but it was inspired by one of the questions that we got, I think, on last year's webinar. It was something to the effect of, what are you either most looking forward to or watching most closely this year? So I've got four things, storylines on our weather to watch for in 2026. And the first one of those is going to be very timely. If you've checked the forecast over the last couple of days, it's what will our snow chances end up being this winter? Of course, to this point in the season, most areas really haven't seen any snow. There's just been some very light snow events back in November and December, one this past weekend, but not a lot of accumulations. And at least based on the current forecast, there's a pretty good chance that will change, at least for some areas, this coming weekend. There's still a lot of uncertainties about this event, as this slide from the Weather Service in Raleigh highlights. But we do know a few things. One is that it is going to get very cold late this week. We'll have a cold front that moves through on Friday and bring in just an Arctic air mass. So at least at the surface, it should be plenty cold enough for frozen precipitation this weekend. After that, it looks like we'll have a low pressure system that forms down to our south and southeast on Saturday. That will bring the moisture in that we need to fuel frozen precipitation. And it looks like there could be quite a bit of moisture with this system. Too early to say at this point what that may fall as. I would say there's a decent chance that across the state we see a mix of snow, sleet, freezing rain, maybe some regular rain right along the coast. But again, tough to say exactly what balance that will be depending on where you go. But I like the way this map puts it. We are now, even though we're 3 or 4 days out, already over a 60% likelihood of having impacts across most of the states. So definitely a system to keep your eye on. And I would say this may be our best and possibly last chance at snow this winter. It looks like February will probably be warmer. That is very common both in La Nina years, but also in our recent climate. Something like the last 15 Februarys have been warmer than normal in North Carolina. So if you want to see some snow, hope that we can squeeze some out from the event this weekend. Another big question is, since we're in drought, we've been in drought for several months, how long will this drought actually last, and when will we start to move out of it? We don't exactly know the answer to this either, but we can sort of get some clues based on past wintertime drought events. The way that I looked at this was plotting some past years where we've had drought in place coming into the winter season, and then seeing when we finally got all that drought off the map in North Carolina. The first thing that might strike you here is that winter droughts have been really common in recent years. This is actually the fifth year in a row that we've had drought across at least parts of the state coming into the winter time. But we can also see when these drought events ended. In a couple cases, like in 2023 and 2024, that drought had ended by the time the winter season was over in February. Now, I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I think the drought is a little bit too entrenched to be done in by just 1 month of rainfall. But I think what we see in some of these other years, like 2013 and 2017, even last year, where we could get some better rain in the springtime and have that drought gone before we get into the summer. I think that is a more realistic scenario based on what we're dealing with now. There was also a case back in 2022 where that drought lasted a little bit longer. It didn't fully end until August, but even there, it was some good summer rainfall that helped us finally dig out. What we don't want to see is what happened a little bit further back. Now, granted, these were more extreme droughts, especially that one back in 2007 and 2008 that started after that record dry year. Another multi-year drought happened back in 2000 and 2001. But what we saw in all those cases was a drought that stuck around through the winter and then stayed with us through the spring and the summer and the rest of the year as well. And in a couple of these cases, really didn't end until the following spring or summer. So I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I really do think that we'll get some better rain at some point over the next 6 months. But just keep in mind, in the past, we have seen some longer lasting droughts like the ones that you see at the bottom here. Another big story, not just for North Carolina, but really for the entire U.S., is will we see a landfalling hurricane this year? As this chart shows, in all of 2025, there were zero hurricane landfalls in the mainland U.S. That is fairly unusual. It hadn't happened in the past decade, and we've had some really active years like 2020 and 2024, where there were five or more landfalling hurricanes. But that's important for North Carolina as well because we haven't had a hurricane that made landfall at hurricane strength since Isaias in 2020. So we're now going on 6 years since our last landfalling hurricane. Now, what we've learned in that time being is that you don't just have to have a storm at the coast to have big impacts. We saw last year what happened with Chantal, again, only a tropical depression when it moved across the Piedmont. The previous year, we had storms like Debbie, but that potential tropical cyclone at the 8th that dropped a lot of rain, and of course, Hurricane Helene at the fall, which made landfall on the Florida coast, and then its remnants moved inland. So I think inland areas really all across the state are very well aware of what any sort of tropical system can do. It sounds a little bit strange to say, but this is just a reminder. Coastal areas are not immune from hurricanes, even though they haven't seen one in a few years. So, again, we'll see what this hurricane season brings and whether there's any more activity along the coastline in the U.S. And the final one, we've mentioned a couple times that we've been in this La Nina pattern really over the past year. It was in place last winter. It's in place right now. Generally, that leads to the drier than normal conditions like we've seen during both of the last two winters. But it looks like that's going to change. It looks like we will pretty quickly transition out of that La Nina as we move into the spring and then potentially move toward an El Nino later this year. Now, the map on the right shows the sort of impacts that we expect at the upper levels from an El Nino event. Generally, that means a stronger jet stream to our south. That tends to bring more storm systems and more moisture up out of the Gulf and along our coastline. So, especially in our cool season, like in the fall and winter, we tend to be wetter during those El Nino years. It can also have impacts on the tropics, though, because we have this southward shifted jet stream that can increase the upper level winds and the wind shear across the tropical Atlantic. So often El Nino years are a little bit less active in the tropical Atlantic. So as those tropical outlooks start coming out this spring, just keep an eye on that word El Nino. See if it appears there. See what influence it has on this season's forecast. But my hope is that if we do shift into an El Nino, maybe we'll finally break this streak of 5 falls and winters in a row where we've had drought. Maybe we'll see some decent precip later this season, hopefully with none of those big hurricane impacts like we just talked about. So that's all I had. And at this point, Allison, I'll turn it back over to you to head up our Q&A.
Thanks, Corey, and thank you, Jared. Really appreciate the comprehensive overview. We don't have any questions in the chat yet. Looks like we've got an observation that I'll share in just a second. So this is your last chance to submit any questions that you have. Please go ahead and do that now. And as a reminder, we will be publishing the climate blog summary at noon. So if you aren't already subscribed, you can scan the QR code here on your screen to sign up for a climate blog. It goes out once or twice a month. And even though I work with these folks, I can tell you I learn something new every time a blog comes out. It is really just that good. So we will be sharing a recording of today's webinar on our YouTube channel, and it should be live by the end of the week. All right. So I'm going to move into one of the observations that was shared in the chat. And Corey, this is in response to drought, so I think this could be right up your alley. Cabe says, according to my CocoRoss gauge, we are nearly 30 inches down in total from the 2022 to 2025 timeframe. This deep coastal clay soil is so dry, it is not absorbing the rain that does fall. Is that something that you're seeing in other coastal areas, Corey?
Yeah, so appreciate the report, Cabe. Cabe was formerly with North Carolina Forest Service and now is still actively contributing to our drought monitoring in North Carolina with his CoCoRaHS reports. So really appreciate that. Yeah, that's a great point, Cabe. We talked about these, consecutive years that we've been in drought, especially late in the season. And you think about that far northeastern corner of the state. For one, they really haven't had a lot of the big tropical events up there. Even some of those storms like Hurricane Ian back in 2022, like Debbie last year, not a lot of the rain from those storms reached up into that far corner of the state. But also, like you said, if you think about the soil depth, the groundwater stores in that area, they're very shallow. So if you get a big rain event, then not all of that moisture will soak in and you can dry out really quickly afterwards. So certainly that's one of usually our canaries in the coal mine. If it starts drying out in the northeast, that tells us that we're probably starting to get into some drought situations. And you're right, there's been a lot of those over the last few years.
And Corey, picking up on that thread of hurricanes, so I know we had some formation this year, but we didn't have any landfall. Is that just because we got lucky?
Yeah, we've seen this several times in the last few years. In some cases, it's been where the first half of the season is more active close to the coast, and then later in the year, we started seeing those storms stay away, stay out to sea. A lot of that has to do with how some of the large scale atmospheric patterns set up. For instance, by August this year, we were under more of a trough in the jet stream, but that still acts as a block for some of these systems as they're moving our way. So, for instance, with Aaron, that's why we saw it curve back out to sea before it actually reached us. I think in some cases you could say we've been lucky in those times, but again, knowing the occurrence of fall drought that we've had over the last 5 years, it wouldn't hurt to see at least a little bit of rain from some of those storms from time to time.
All right, awesome. So for the next one, I'm going to hand this one over to Jared. Nikhil asked about the U.S. Leaving various climate agreements and how this may impact future emissions and weather.
Yeah, yeah, definitely what I would say I would have to be doing, and so probably not good to speculate, but just to iterate the point that, we'd have left these agreements, and there will be some likely impacts, but I think we'll have to wait and see what that all has to how that all plays out.
Thanks, Jared. We've got a question from Andy. So, Corey, I think this one might be up your alley. On a more local scale, are there growing urban environments affecting thunderstorm formation and nighttime temps? I know one of the things we've seen is a growth in our urban areas.
Yeah, I'll start with the second half of that, and that for sure is affecting those overnight temperatures. Anytime we're seeing these sprawling urban areas, any, more developed areas, paved land, that certainly will hold those nighttime temperatures higher. But I think it's also important to note that when we look back historically over the last century or more, we do still have a lot of rural sites where we've got good, reliable climate data. Those areas are also showing that increase in nighttime low temperatures. So it's more pronounced in some of those more developing urban areas, but this is still a trend that's happening all across the state. And then in terms of how that's affecting thunderstorm formation, gosh, that's a great question and one that we've heard a lot in recent years. In some cases, people seem to think that warmer summertime land where it's more urbanized tends to fuel showers and thunderstorms forming. In other places, people seem to think that it forms a dome that keeps thunderstorms away. So we've looked at some local conditions like out over the Rocky Mountain and Tarboro areas, found there's really not a lot of statistically significant conclusions you can make about that, about whether it's affecting thunderstorm formation. At this point, I would say any effect is probably fairly minimal. What ends up having more of an effect, though, is when you're in a very wet spell, like we were last year after Chantal, having that much more moisture present in the atmosphere and in the environment can help provide fuel for further thunderstorm activity. And then likewise, if you're in a drought event, as the soils especially dry out, there's not as much moisture that can be evaporated and turn into clouds and thunderstorms. So drought can really be a feedback loop that causes fewer storms to happen. So I think those are probably the more significant influences on some of those local thunderstorm conditions.
All right. I think the questions have slowed down, so maybe we go ahead and wrap it up for today. Thank you all for joining us. As I mentioned, we will be sharing the recording to this as soon as it's ready later this week. Take care, everyone.